let me put it in a nutshell. Luther, in the heat of debate, was arguing against purgatory. And when his debate partners pointed out that purgatory is implied by a statement in 2 Maccabees that it's a good thing to pray for the dead, he adopted the radical rebuttal of decanonizing 2 Maccabees. And then he couldn't just remove Maccabees from the Bible. He had some kind of principle or some kind of rationale that he was appealing to. So what he did was he appealed to essentially the Jewish tradition, which also influenced St. Jerome. And St. Jerome, who learned Hebrew from a Jewish rabbi. And so St. Jerome casts doubt on 7 books of the Old Testament, the so-called deuterocanonical books, in his prologues to the Vulgate. St. Jerome's doubts were rejected by the church as a whole, notably by Augustine, but then other church councils. But Luther went with St. Jerome's doubts and essentially adopted the Jewish Bible as the Christian Old Testament. Okay, so that is what Protestants are doing. They're basically using the Jewish Bible as their Old Testament. And I hate to be blunt about it, but what Protestants do is reject the Christian tradition of Old Testament scripture, which was crystallized, written down, and affirmed by the late 4th and early 5th century councils of the church, going back especially to the Council of Rome in 382 under Pope Damasus I, the same pope that commissioned the Vulgate from St. Jerome. It's under Pope Damasus I that we first get the Catholic canon as we have it today, written down in a church document, and thereafter it's just affirmed. But Protestants like to say, oh, these books are never part of the Bible, but read Augustine. Augustine lists all of them as part of the Bible. That's a shock to Lutherans and Calvinists. It was a shock to me when at age 30, after getting 2 master's degrees in Scripture from a very fine Calvinist seminary, I read Augustine on the canon of Scripture for the first time and discovered that these so-called non-biblical books that I thought that Catholics had added into the Bible at the Council of Trent were actually listed right there by St. Augustine. So St. Augustine lists them, all the saints list them all through the Middle Ages, Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, they all list them as scriptural. And then Luther calls them into question, and they're reaffirmed by Trent. But here's something important that I think all of our listeners should know, Matt, and that is there's a Protestant accusation out there that no ecumenical council ever affirmed the 7 deuterocanonical books of the Old Testament as part of the canon prior to Trent. And that's part of a polemic against Catholicism where they say, you Catholics added them in at Trent. However, that's not true, because the Council of Florence in 1441, roughly, it met over a series of years, but the Council of Florence, which was an ecumenical council, lists them all in 1441, which is 70 or 80 years before the Reformation breaks out in 1517. So they actually were included in an ecumenical council long before the whole Protestant fiasco was on anybody's radar.